We had been told to expect a war of annihilation, a brutal clash against a populace welded to its Bolshevik masters. Instead, we were met with flowers. In the summer of 1941, as our panzer columns rolled across the borders of the Soviet Union, the first reports from the front were almost unbelievable. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, nations that had known barely a year of Soviet occupation but had felt its full weight, our soldiers were greeted not as conquerors, but as liberators. Villagers offered bread and salt. Partisan groups, formed in secret to resist the Red Army, now emerged to fight alongside us. The memory of their stolen independence was a fresh bleeding wound, and they saw in our advance the only hope of cauterizing it. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Further south, in the sprawling territories of Ukraine, the sentiment was the same. Here, the scars of forced collectivization and the Holodomor were etched into the very soul of the people. They saw our arrival as the end of Stalin's yoke, an opportunity to reclaim their land and their dignity. From the Caucasus, too, came similar signals of welcome. We had stumbled, almost by accident, into a vast reservoir of anti-Soviet sentiment. Here was an army of millions waiting to be raised, a weapon that could dismantle the Soviet regime from within. The potential was staggering. It could shorten the war, save hundreds of thousands of German lives, and secure a victory that was already, by the autumn, beginning to look less certain. From my position in the General Staff, I and a handful of other officers watched this unfold with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. We saw the path to victory laid bare before us, a proclamation of liberation, the formation of national committees, the promise of self-determination. These political acts would have been more potent than a dozen panzer divisions. Yet, from the Führer's headquarters, there was only silence, then outright rejection. The doctrine of Untermensch was not to be swayed by strategic reality. Field Marshal von Bock's memorandum, arguing for the creation of a Russian Liberation Army, was dismissed. The proposal from the Smolensk Committee, a body of local collaborators, met the same fate. The opportunity was being squandered, thrown away in favor of a racial dogma that was actively undermining our military objectives. As the first snows of the winter of 1941 to 42 began to fall, turning the autumn mud into a frozen hell, the consequences of this blindness became brutally clear. Our supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Our manpower bled white by the relentless fighting and the savage cold. It was in this crucible of desperation that necessity began to override ideology. Field commanders, starved of reinforcements, began to quietly recruit local volunteers, Hilfswillige or Hueys, to serve as drivers, cooks, and ammunition carriers. Soon, these men were picking up rifles and fighting in the line. By the following year, their numbers would swell into the hundreds of thousands, an unofficial, unacknowledged army born of pragmatism. For us in the staff, this was the crack in the door. If military pressure could not force a change in grand strategy, perhaps it could at least compel a change in policy. Our first battle was not for a city or a river, but for something far more mundane, the official recognition, pay, and rations for the very men who were already dying for our cause. Then, in the summer of 1942, the forests around the Volkhov Pocket delivered to us the one man who could give this nascent movement a voice. When General Andrey Vlasov was brought into our lines, he was not just another high-ranking prisoner. He was a decorated hero of the Soviet Union, the commander of the Second Shock Army, a man who had held the line at the gates of Moscow only months before. His defection was a bombshell, But for my branch, Foreign Armies East, it was confirmation. Everything we had been arguing, that deep wells of opposition to Stalin's regime existed even within the Red Army's command structure, was now personified in this tall, charismatic, and articulate officer. Vlasov was not a broken man seeking survival. He was a patriot with a vision. In our interrogations, which quickly turned into discussions, he spoke of a new Russia, free from Stalin and his commissars. He dreamed of leading a Russian national army of liberation, fighting not for Germany, but for Russia itself. His first proclamation, drafted with our assistance, was smuggled across the lines and broadcast into the Soviet trenches. The effect was immediate and electric. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers deserted, risking execution by their own side to cross over to ours, many clutching the leaflets bearing Vlasov's name. He impressed every German officer he met. He was intelligent, composed, and possessed a clear-eyed understanding of the political and military situation. Here, at last, was the figurehead we needed, the man who could unite the disparate anti-Soviet elements under a single banner. But our optimism was swiftly crushed against the wall of the Führer's ideology. Hitler saw only a pawn. Vlasov could be used for propaganda, his name and face plastered on pamphlets to encourage desertion, but he was never to be trusted with an actual army. The Führer's decree was absolute. There would be no promises of an independent Russian state. Thus, the Vlasov movement was born as a hollow shell. We created a phantom army for propaganda purposes, and at Dabendorf, south of Berlin, we established a school for Russian volunteers, training them as future leaders for an army that did not exist. By the beginning of 1943, we had managed to organize nearly 150,000 of these Eastern troops into proper battalions, but that was the limit. Policy from the highest level deliberately kept them fragmented, dispersed among German divisions. There was a deep-seated fear that a unified Russian force would one day turn its guns on us. Even the proclamation from the Smolensk Committee, a document outlining a vision for a new Russia that could have galvanized support, languished for months in the bureaucratic morass of the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories. By the time it was finally approved for distribution, the remnants of the Sixth Army were freezing to death in the ruins of Stalingrad. The greatest political weapon we possessed had been left locked away until after our greatest military defeat. Despite the shadow of Stalingrad, we felt a fragile momentum. We had to act. In May 1943, my group launched our most ambitious effort yet, codenamed Operation Silver Lining. It was a massive propaganda campaign, timed to coincide with the planned summer offensive, Operation Citadel. Millions of leaflets, bearing Vlasov's signature and promising good treatment, land for peasants, and the abolition of the collective farm system, were prepared. The plan was simple. As our armies broke through the Soviet front, this political weapon would shatter their rear, encouraging mass desertions and turning their soldiers against the regime. But Citadel was postponed, again and again. While the panzers waited, our campaign went ahead, a solo instrument playing a piece meant for a full orchestra. We saw a moderate increase in desertions, but it was a trickle where we had hoped for a flood. The decisive blow, however, came not from the front lines, but from the Berghof. On June 8th, a message filtered down from the Führer's headquarters that extinguished what little hope remained. Field Marshal Keitel had presented our proposals for granting the Russian volunteers a degree of political recognition. Hitler's reaction was one of pure fury. The report we received was chilling in its finality. Any talk of a future Russian state was forbidden. Any promises made to the Russian people were to cease immediately. Vlasov was to be used for one purpose, and one purpose only: deception. His name could be used to lure men across the lines, but they were to be treated as nothing more than auxiliary labor, without rights or a future. The illusion of collaboration was shattered. We were not building a partnership. We were orchestrating a lie, and the volunteers were its intended victims. As the failure of Citadel at Kursk turned the tide of the war irrevocably against us, this ideological rigidity curdled into paranoia. Fearing widespread mutiny, Hitler ordered all foreign volunteer units to be disarmed. It was a catastrophic decision, threatening to undo years of painstaking work and turn tens of thousands of armed, trained men against us overnight. Only with frantic effort were we able to mitigate the order, arguing that a mass disarmament would be a logistical nightmare and a gift to Soviet propaganda. A compromise was reached. The Eastern battalions would be transferred to the Western Front to fight against the British and Americans. The volunteers understood this move for what it was: a profound vote of no confidence. We had armed them to fight Bolshevism, and now we were shipping them away because we no longer trusted them near their homeland. Their morale plummeted. To this growing crisis was added a new internal enemy. Heinrich Himmler and the SS had long viewed our Vlasov movement with suspicion, seeing it as a direct challenge to their racial doctrines. Now, they began a campaign of bureaucratic warfare, actively working to undermine our efforts, seeing in our pragmatism a threat to their own vision of a racially pure empire. We were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Red Army and another against the ideological zealots in our own government. And then, in the dying months of 1944, came the ultimate bitter irony. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the high priest of racial purity and the movement's most powerful enemy, suddenly became its sponsor. It was a conversion born not of conviction, but of utter desperation. With the Red Army at the borders of the Reich, the architect of our ideological war now sought salvation from the very men he had condemned. Overnight, the bureaucratic obstacles vanished. In Prague, the Committee for the Liberation of the Russian Peoples was officially proclaimed, and Andrey Vlasov was finally granted what he had been promised for years: command of his own armed forces. 2 divisions were authorized, the 600th and 651st Infantry. They were formed from the scattered eastern battalions, from prisoners of war, and from forced laborers. We watched the ghostly ceremonies in early 1945 as these men swore an oath to a new Russia, a country that existed only in their hopes. It was a political theater of the macabre. An army was being born on its deathbed, equipped with weapons scraped from the bottom of the barrel, destined to fight in a war that was already lost. They were given a flag and an anthem, but they were never given a chance. Vlasov understood this. He knew his only hope lay not in fighting for a doomed Germany, but in preserving his men as a coherent anti-communist force. As the Reich crumbled, he led his divisions south, away from the Oder front, in a desperate attempt to reach the American lines in the west. His goal was not victory, but survival, to surrender to the Western Allies and offer his army as a future bulwark against Stalin. It was a logical, calculated gamble, but one that failed to account for a political reality decided thousands of miles away, in a conference room at Yalta. There, the Allied leaders had made a pact. All citizens of the Soviet Union found in German-controlled territory were to be forcibly repatriated, whether they wished it or not. When Vlasov's men surrendered to the Americans, they were met not with asylum, but with cold bureaucracy. They were not seen as allies or political defectors. They were categorized as Soviet property, to be handed over to the NKVD. The betrayal was absolute. We could only watch in impotent horror as these men, who had risked everything to escape Stalin's tyranny, were herded into trucks and delivered back into the hands of their executioners. Vlasov himself was captured and, along with his senior commanders, hanged in Moscow in 1946. In the end, the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of volunteers meant nothing. The vast potential to turn a significant portion of a hostile population against its own oppressive regime was squandered. It was a casualty not of the battlefield, but of an ideology so rigid it could not bend even to save itself. The greatest psychopolitical weapon we ever possessed had been systematically dismantled by our own leadership. It was not the Red Army that defeated the Russian liberation movement. It was Adolf Hitler. The tragedy of the Eastern Volunteers was a symptom of a deeper sickness, a rot that was consuming the Reich from its very core. As the fronts crumbled throughout 1944, the atmosphere at the Führer's headquarters became a surreal blend of delusional optimism and paranoid suspicion. My own position as head of Foreign Armies East grew increasingly perilous. My task was to present the unvarnished truth of the situation on the Eastern Front. Yet the truth was the one thing the Führer refused to hear. Each briefing became a battle of wills. I would present our meticulously compiled figures, the number of new Soviet rifle divisions, the staggering production rates of their T-34 tanks, and Hitler would sweep them aside with a wave of his hand. It was a bluff, he would insist, a deception by a desperate enemy. My staff were not analysts, he accused, but defeatists. It was in this suffocating climate that the whispers began. Men I had known and respected for years, officers like General Adolf Heusinger, chief of the operations branch, and General Helmuth Stief, began to speak in guarded tones of a final drastic solution. I was aware of the conspiracy taking shape around Colonel von Stauffenberg, but I kept my distance. My duty, as I saw it, was to preserve the integrity of my intelligence apparatus, the one remaining instrument of military reason in a command structure that had abandoned it. My war was fought on maps and in reports, not with bombs. Simultaneously, I was fighting another battle, a bureaucratic war against the SS. Walter Schellenberg, head of the SD's foreign intelligence, saw the army's impending collapse as an opportunity to consolidate all intelligence functions under his control. He maneuvered constantly to discredit our work and absorb my branch. I argued fiercely that frontline intelligence could not be directed from a desk in Berlin, that command decisions depended on the raw, immediate data we provided. Yet I knew it was a losing fight. The party was consuming the state. Then, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. In early July, a minor infection in my hand suddenly erupted into a severe case of blood poisoning. I was rushed to a hospital, consumed by a raging fever. It was from that sterile, quiet room that I heard the news on the 20th of July. A bomb had exploded at the Wolf's Lair. The attempt on Hitler's life had failed. My feverish haze was pierced by the chilling realization of what would follow. The Gestapo began its purge, and the names that filled the arrest lists were those of my colleagues and friends. Stief, Feldgiebel, many others, all were swept away. My illness, which had felt like a death sentence, had become my alibi. It had saved my life. Lying there, I understood that the regime was not just losing the war, it was devouring itself. And I knew My only remaining duty was to salvage what I could from the wreckage, not for the Führer, but for what might come after. I began making plans to secure my files. When I returned to my post, the final vindication of our work was the most catastrophic. In January 1945, the Soviet winter offensive erupted along the Vistula, a tidal wave of men and steel that we had predicted with near-perfect accuracy for months. Our reports had been dismissed, our assessments of enemy strength ridiculed. Hitler, fixated on the Ardennes, had stripped the Eastern Front of its last reserves, leaving it a hollow shell. Now, that shell shattered. The Red Army poured into the heartlands of Germany, and with them came stories of unimaginable brutality, looting, murder, and mass rape that gave a terrifying urgency to our defeat. My priority was no longer the Reich, but survival of my family and of the truth we had compiled. Using the last vestiges of my authority, I forged travel permits and requisitioned transport, assembling a small convoy to evacuate my staff and, more importantly, our archives. Packed into dozens of steel footlockers were the raw materials of our work: microfilm spools, card indexes, and detailed assessments of the Soviet military political machine. We drove south into the relative safety of Bavaria, and there, in scattered locations, in abandoned mine shafts and the cellars of secluded houses, we hid our treasure. The war against Hitler was lost. I was now focused on ensuring that the war against Stalin would not be. My intelligence network was the one asset Germany possessed that would have value in the world to come, and I intended to offer it to the only powers capable of continuing the fight: the Western Allies. Confirmation that I was on the right path came through a clandestine channel, a quiet message from a contact in British intelligence. It was a brief but electrifying affirmation. Mr. Churchill, I was told, expressed his appreciation for the quality of my branch's work and shared our assessment of the long-term Soviet threat. My enemies in the West saw the same storm gathering that I did. It was all the assurance I needed. As Berlin's fall became a matter of weeks, then days, I moved the remnants of my command into the Alps. We operated out of a small village, a ghost headquarters for a dying army. My staff consisted of a handful of loyal officers, all of us fugitives in waiting. The final reports arrived, each one a nail in Germany's coffin. In one of my last communications with High Command, I looked at the maps showing the unbroken Soviet advance through the forests of Brandenburg. I made one last, unorthodox proposal. We could not stop them with divisions we no longer had, but we could still use the land itself. We could set the forests ablaze, create a wall of fire to check their advance, if only for a few days. The suggestion was met with silence. The time for strategy, even desperate strategy, was over. The time for surrender was at hand.